Hi, this is Dr. Frank Chopatini of the Church of Rational Truth. Today, first, we're going to talk about old business, and that is the passive income we got from last month. I think it's like $19.94, something around there. The two options for voting are going to be for either reinvestment into a physical church or reinvestment into the general endowment. So members will vote this week. Just send their votes into churchofrationaltruth@gmail.com. And then they should be due Friday at midnight. Saturday we'll tally everything. And then Sunday we'll kind of say, okay, what percentage of what is going where based on the votes that come in. Just a warning for anybody who's watching this video. This week's topic is child molestation and pedophilia. It's been very controversial. We've had a lot of talks coming off of Pride Month about different sexualities. A lot of people trying to push for pedophilia as an acceptable sexuality or whether it should even be considered a sexuality. A lot of strong opinions, and I just want to warn people before we get into this lecture any further that this is going to be a very straight talk. We're going to talk about some very uncomfortable topics. We're going to talk about things that are very controversial and that might be very triggering for people, especially if they've had to deal with molestation in the past or if they've had family members or friends that have had to deal with it. It is something that is very common and prevalent in society, and I think that we should have an open and honest conversation, but not everybody is ready, willing, or wants to have that conversation because it is very uncomfortable. For me, I've got a background in family medicine. I've done a lot of work with child psychiatry, and honestly, it is a conversation I have to have with a lot of parents because I've dealt with a lot of children who have gone through molestation. I've gone through a lot of my adult patients who have been molested in the past. It is I want to say horrifically common, but it is far more common than people realize. I would say from my adult patient population, I would say somewhere between 20 and 35% of my adult population has had some sort of molestation or inappropriate sexual touching at a young age. With my work with children, I have dealt with a lot of children who have been inappropriately touched themselves from family members or friends. I've had a good number of children who we're going to kind of bridge a little bit on child sexuality, not necessarily just molestation, who have had sexual touching or touching of a sexual nature with other children, which is also a complicated topic because you're kind of left with what do you do with an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old who are exploring things sexually? That's a very difficult conversation. It's a very hard conversation to have. But I think this topic is going to mainly be based on child molestation, pedophilia, and the morality of those, what is right and wrong. As a church, the way we approach everything is that morals are very fluid and situation dependent. So I don't want to necessarily put like hard lines. I know everybody's gonna be like, if you don't absolutely blast pedophilia, you're already gonna get absolutely destroyed by everybody. But I want to have an open discussion because I think I've seen a lot of people, whenever you bring up the topic, or not when I don't really bring up the topic, but when the topic is brought up, some people take this hardline stance of, oh, all pedophiles need to be shot and killed. And the terrible thing about that rhetoric is it ends a conversation. You can't have a conversation about it when you take such harsh rhetoric. No one is going to try to argue against that because you don't want to be on the side of pro-pedophile. It looks really terrible, so people won't take it. And when someone is that hard, you can't really reason with them. You can't really talk with them. You can't really get into the details of it. So I think it's not really talking like, oh, yes, pedophiles aren't that bad. I think you need to have an open conversation. You need to talk about what is causing these people to do this. What is the good and bad of it? What is appropriate? What is immoral? Why is it immoral? Rather than just lambasting and just making broad generalizations about it. That being said, yes, child sexuality and pedophilia, not a good thing. There's a reason why there's laws. There should be laws. This is not a video that's going to go, oh, yay, pedophilia is good. But what I want to do is I want to have more of a conversation of why are these things wrong? What are the situations why they're wrong? How do we delve into the morality and ethics of it rather than just broadly stating, oh, yes, this is horrible. It all needs to stop. First, it's hard. It's such a big topic. I don't know where we'll start, but I want to start maybe from some of the things that I've seen in terms of how it even happens. I would say the vast majority, I know most families are usually afraid of, oh, some random stranger coming and picking up my child and molesting them. But I would say that is a rarity. I have seen that almost never happen. I can't say it's impossible, but I would say in terms of what I've seen in my clinic for my patients, I don't think I've ever heard a story, or I would say if it is a very rare story of a complete stranger actually being that or doing that. I would say that's more likely in someone just absolutely being kidnapped. But in terms of most pedophilia or child molestation cases, all the ones I've seen, or almost all the ones I've seen, is usually someone who is very close to the family, usually someone who is either in the family or so trusted they're trusted like a family member. Usually it's someone who they think they can trust. Usually it's someone who is awfully close to the child. It's usually someone who is trusted enough to be with the child alone or has a lot of one-on-one time with the child. I would say a very big percentage of cases is usually a very direct family member. Most cases I have seen have been somewhat incestuous. I want to say about 50-50, but then again, these are rough stats. I haven't looked into hard stats on it, but this is me speaking off the top of my head. A vast majority are fathers, a vast majority are uncles. There's a good number of neighbors and close family friends. That's generally who I see. It's people who are usually given the authority to look after this person or to have basically unsupervised time with the child or the underage person. That is the vast majority of cases. This idea that there's all these strangers or this random neighbor who's going to do it, I think those are a minority of cases. Not saying that it doesn't exist, and I'm not saying that it's less worrisome, but I would say that in the public mind versus in reality, I think there's a big discrepancy in terms of what people are afraid of and what actually ends up being the real life perpetrator in many of these cases. I would say many of the cases that I have seen, it weirdly enough sometimes runs in families, or you'll see a large history of this happening in groups. A lot of times I will see that someone themselves has been molested, or the person that has molested them had a history of molestation. I can't say too much on exactly why that happens, but if I was going to take some educated guesses, I think what happens is many times those people end up associating childhood or young ages with sexuality because they were touched sexually, or they become sexualized at a very young age. They therefore associate young ages with sexuality in general. And it's kind of like how most sexual fetishes develop. People who had something sexual happen around shoes, then associated shoes with sexuality. And then it's kind of easy to draw that conclusion of someone who was a child who ended up having things sexually done to them have now associated sexuality with youth and childhood. That is what I see in many cases where there's a family history, or there's kind of a thread that you can kind of trace back through multiple people who have been molested or sexually assaulted at a young age. And then kind of the cycle continues. That person who ended up being molested years ago now ends up turning around and becoming the person who molests in the future. I'm not saying that excuses it, but it does kind of explain why many people do have that. Another one where people often go to is talking about power and power differential, that people do it because they want to have a sense of power, and someone who's young and weak is powerless. I can't say how much I've seen of that. I see the theoretical potential for it, but it's hard to say what percentage of actual cases are based on that pathology or that reasoning. I would say let's shift maybe more into the morality. We got to look at this and go, okay, why is this a bad thing? And that probably sounds like an absolutely crazy sentiment to bring up. Like, obviously it's a bad thing, but why? Why is this thing immoral? What harm is being done? What is the bad thing? And a lot of the arguments basically come down to consent, or the ability for someone to actually say that they want to do things. The problem with children and sexuality is people will argue that the child is incapable of consenting. I would use a more specific argument. I probably wouldn't say that children are not capable of consenting. I would say children do not have the ability to have informed consent. A lot of times this is going to get to a very difficult and uneasy discussion, but this is where I would want to talk a little bit about child sexuality. Children do develop sexuality at somewhat younger than we'd like ages. I would say most children around 8 through 13 start developing some knowledge of sex and sexuality. Usually it's very vague. Usually they don't have a very good idea of what it is, but they do understand that they do have genitals. Those genitals feel good at certain times, and they start developing some thoughts, but they're not well formed. They're not well identified, and a lot of times it's very hazy or not clear what even those things mean. So a lot of people will just say, oh, someone at that age can't consent. I would say they cannot give an informed consent, which is the problem. A lot of times I've had some patients who have actually, a lot of patients don't want to say this, but a lot of times this happens, and a lot of times it doesn't get reported because in a lot of these situations, the child actually does get some sort of pleasure or benefit from it. I would say many of the cases I've seen, it's not really as much of a sexual benefit as it's more of an attention benefit. A lot of times the perpetrators are successful, or the perpetrators have this actually happen because usually the child is looking for attention, or the child actually does not mind the physical touch. I would say probably more of the attention than anything. And because it doesn't necessarily feel bad, or they don't understand why it's bad, they don't report it, they don't stop it. Obviously, if it was more of the case where the child feels threatened or not right, those cases, the child is more likely to come forward and tell someone. It's more likely to be brought up or brought to light. Not always, especially in cases where a lot of times it happens because the rest of the family is not being vigilant or not taking the child's safety and putting it first. Those are cases more when someone is being malicious and the child is being hurt or not I don't want to say consenting. The child is clearly not I don't want to say enjoying either. The child is complicit, I will use. If the child is not complicit, usually those cases usually happen more in the case of child neglect, where the family also really doesn't care about the child's welfare, and they're either taking the threats not seriously or not looking for the threats. But I would say there's a certain percentage of cases that can go on and can go on for a long period of time because the child is not aware of why the actions they're doing are bad or why this thing is immoral. And a lot of that is they are young. There's a reason why we have ages of consent, or there's a reason why we have all these laws that say at a certain age you're allowed to do something. It is because we are assuming that it takes this amount of time before the person gets the knowledge to be able to make a well-informed decision about it. In terms of legality and morality, the big question is most jurisdictions have kind of said 18. 18 is the age of consent. Some jurisdictions are slightly different. Some are 17, some are 16, or very rare exceptions internationally, 14. But the reason they kind of do that is because you're trying to put a hard limit on things, because laws do a lot better or a lot easier to enforce when you have a hard limit where you can compare two things in one fashion and say, yuck, this is good because X, Y, Z, versus if you take a more indistinct way of telling if something is illegal versus immoral, that's a lot harder to put limits on. That's a lot harder to enforce. So, for example, if you put in a law, okay, it's illegal to have sex with anybody under 18. If you're over 18, that's really easy to enforce. You can look at date of births. You can check the 2 date of births between the people. You have a sexual event. Boom. Very easy to prove or disprove. Versus if you have kind of more how the church would handle it, if you have more of, is this person able to properly consent to this in terms of their mental abilities and in terms of their knowledge of sexuality and the morality of it, that's really hard to enforce. You'd have to get an in-depth psychological profile. You'd have to have a good understanding of what the person actually does understand. You have to hope that what they say is actually accurate. And that's way more difficult to try to enforce in a legal manner. So the laws are set up in a specific way where you can actually get things to enforce. And I want to bring up probably an important point here. Just because the law is a certain way does not mean that necessarily means that is completely ethical, the way the laws have it in place. I would argue that the laws do a very good job of trying to get what is moral and ethical into law, but I think they don't necessarily do a perfect job. The reason I would argue that is because more always we talk about how morality is general and relative. And I would argue the reason they put that age in is because usually that age is assumed that that person has the mental capacity to make an informed decision and to have informed consent is probably what I want to use. I'm sorry, someone is messaging me on another thing. Let's mute that. So, like, for example, you can say 18 by most people at the age of 18 will be knowledgeable enough, they will be well informed enough to be able to make an informed decision about sexuality and sexual activity. They've had experience with it through their lives. They kind of know the repercussions of sexuality. They know about sexually transmitted diseases. They know about pregnancy and having children. Therefore, they can make an informed consent on whether or not they want to do a sexual act with another person. That is nice because in 95%, 99% of the cases, it will actually be true. Most 18-year-olds have that ability to consent. They have that knowledge. But the problem is it's not going to cover 100% of cases. I would argue that it's probably much more fluid in terms of when someone actually has that ability to give an informed consent. And I would argue that 18 is a really good cutoff, and it cuts off nicely at the upper limit where it's going to say, okay, 95% of people are going to be able to do it at that level. But the problem is, in reality, there's going to be times where people younger than that and older than that are going to cross those lines. So, for example, if someone is 17 and 364 days old, does that one day automatically, boom, now they've got all this more knowledge, now they can make an informed consent? Probably not. That one day is not making a huge difference in terms of how they're developed. Is that a huge crime versus someone who has gotten that one extra day and now is completely 18? Obviously not. But the hard thing is the law has a hard time trying to put that into hard facts. It's hard to codify that. I would even argue it goes both ways. You can have people who are younger than 18 that probably have the ability to have an informed consent, but that's hard to judge. You probably also have people who are 18 and older who do not have the ability to have an informed consent. So I would argue that you could see the morality switch on both sides of that spectrum, but I think the thing about those ages at 16, 17, 18, those are pretty reasonable ages for that. That's kind of more of when do you want to cut off this threshold where the majority of people are going to have a well-informed consent about sexuality and be able to handle that decision in a rational and proper way. There will still be people, because things are fluid and situations are different, where you could easily argue slightly below that age and above that age, there are percentages of people who still cannot make that decision and who can make that decision. I would say it's probably more of a percentage thing. Like the younger you drop it, probably a higher percentage of people are not. The higher you move it, probably the greater percentage of people, because it's probably a statistical distribution of at what age is this person able to consent. And further out from that age, you're going to see a shifting percentage. But those ages are given because they're trying to say, okay, in our society, what amount is an amount where we think it is acceptable that about everybody should be able to have that ability to consent. But I would argue morally, you could have people slightly younger or even slightly older than that number. The higher up you get with that number, that percentage is going to be really small. But I would argue the case is if you have someone who, let's say, has autism or an intellectual disability, even though they're 18, that disability, or even let's say someone was raised in a very conservative manner where they do not have much knowledge of sexuality, pregnancy, STDs, I would argue some of them are still not able to give informed consent, even though they're technically past the legal age of consent, because they don't have that knowledge necessary to make a informed decision and to give an informed consent, versus a non-informed consent where someone really doesn't know what's going on, but they say yes, which is, I think, what can happen at much younger ages. But it would probably be a curve where the further you put out that age, the smaller percentage of people you have to worry about is, and the younger you put that age, the higher and higher that percentage gets. The cross or the opposite example I would give for that is a 17-year-old. You don't know. There's going to be a certain percentages of 17-year-olds who probably could give a good informed consent. You know, one case being let's say someone, I've seen cases before where people get pregnant at 14, 15. They've already had a child. They already know about the consequences of sexuality because they've already dealt with. Now they're 17 years old. They've kind of been around the block and they have some carnal knowledge, if I'm going to use biblical terms. And that person probably has a much greater ability to have some sort of informed consent in terms of sexuality than by far the average 17-year-old. But that's also very hard to put into law. That's very hard to actually set standards. And what law needs is it needs hard standards to be able to draw that. But then again, the further out you get from that age, the younger you get, that high, the percentage is going to be much higher of the people who cannot properly give a kind of informed consent or a well-known consent. So what I would say, obviously the morality is complicated, but I think the laws are, pretty good. And there's also a reason why there's a lot of Romeo and Juliet laws. There's a reason why they've got a lot of like wiggle room for certain situations, because there are certain situations that are morally and legally ambiguous. If someone is 18 and someone is 17 and a half, should that be pedophilia and illegal? Should we put laws about that? But then they've got lots of laws where say, well, these are the kind of exceptions because it's not always that hard cut, or it's not easy to put that hard cut line in there. Let's talk maybe a little bit about pedophilia as a sexuality. A lot of people I've seen on a couple of threads on Reddit where some people, and usually it's trolls, people are trying to troll because of all the LGBT movements and all these movements towards different sexualities and different ways of defining sexualities that people on the internet, some real and some not real, are trying to push pedophilia as a sexuality. Some people argue that pedophilia is absolutely not a sexuality because it's illegal. Some people say it is a sexuality because that is someone's sexual preference. If someone has a sexual preference towards men, how is that any different than having a sexual preference towards children? And I think a lot of people will just flat out say, no, it's not a sexuality. I would say a lot of this is just semantics. A lot of this is, how do you want to define a sexuality? A lot of this is, how do you want to, define what is right and wrong? I think some people want to try and catch people on semantics, where they'll try to where some people will argue, having any sexuality is not immoral, and so then therefore other people will counter argue, well then how would, if pedophilia is a sexuality, would you think that's not immoral? I think it's a lot of semantics traps. I think they're just trying to get people based on their definitions rather than actually having an honest discussion about the morality and ethics. I would say, depending on what your definition of a sexuality is, you could possibly call pedophilia a sexuality, where can someone actually say that their sexual preference or their sexual desire is based on someone who is underage or young. I would say if you give that definition, you can argue that pedophilia is a sexuality. But I would also say, just because something is a sexuality doesn't mean that it's automatically sacred and that you can't have laws about it, or that you can't have punishments, or that you can't have a discussion about morality and immorality, because it's a lot of it is based on what is moral and immoral. And just because someone has a sexuality towards something does not mean that it automatically gets all these protections. I would say some people try to argue in the laws that, because it's sexuality and we don't discriminate, that we have to make laws, that you cannot make laws about it, or therefore it becomes automatically untouchable. But I would say this is a big hazy area where you probably have to look at the who gets hurt in this situation. I would say just because something becomes a sexuality or is deemed as a sexuality doesn't necessarily mean that should be 100% protected. I would say it depends on this is bad because the thing is, you don't want to like trudge on people's sexualities in terms of having alternative sexualities, but you also have to weigh that against people's ability to not be harmed. So what I would say is, yes, someone can have it as a sexuality. Someone can define themselves as a sexuality. You can't necessarily arrest them for stating that or do something because they state that. But I would also say that doesn't mean that you allow the actions. That doesn't mean that you don't have the consequences, that you don't have the legal repercussions for those actions, because those actions are actually doing harm. I do think that there is a lot of not wanting to normalize it as a sexuality. And that, to me, morally has a back and forth. I think one of the problems we have as a society is how we react to this discussion. A lot of times we have very visceral, we have very strong emotional reactions to this. The hard thing is visceral and emotional reactions stop conversation. They stop us from being able to work out things. They stop us from being able to get towards resolutions. They stop us from having a discussion. So I think we have to move away from having these hard, visceral reactions, and we have to be able to have open, difficult discussions about this. People who are trying to say that it is sexuality and that it can be normalized, I would say you should listen to what they have to say, but not necessarily agree. I would say, yes, someone could argue that it's a sexuality, but I would argue that it probably shouldn't be normalized in terms of something that should be allowed in the vast, vast majority of situations. I would say we should get to the point of being able to talk about it. The one interesting statistic I have is, or the one interesting thing that I would like to bring up is that I have a good number of patients who have had to deal with sexual molestation and being molested. I have never had a patient come to me to talk about them having molested someone. And that, if you look at the statistics of the number of people who have been molested versus the number of people who actually come for treatment for molesting people, that I think is very scary, because you already have a hard enough time having people come out to try to seek help or treatment for being molested, but you have almost nobody who of their free will comes to help on their problem of molesting children. And I think that's a lot of how we react to it. We make it so evil or so frowned upon that the people who are actually dealing with this, who even want to seek help, are probably not seeking help because of it, because they're afraid of society's reaction. They're afraid that they're not even going to be able to discuss it, or they're afraid that they're not even going to be able to have someone who sees them as a human being. Sometimes these people are human beings with problems. Sometimes they are people who have been caught in this cycle, who have an association, who may not even want to have this, but because of things that have happened in their past or because of how their brain is wired, it is a compulsion or something that is difficult. And if we don't have a nice conversation, or if we don't have it where those people actually feel like they can discuss what's going on, we can't solve that problem. It gets pushed into the back rooms, it gets pushed into the closets, and those people only hide their problem rather than trying to work on it. A lot of times when I have parents whose children have been either doing something of a sexual nature or who have been the victim of child molestation, a lot of times the parents will not talk about it, or the parents will brush it under the rug. The parents will make euphemisms that are very difficult for the children to understand, or the parents will just flat out just not talk about it. It will become this giant taboo subject. And the problem is the children still have questions. The children don't understand it. And so the children don't ever get a good way of solving it or fixing the problem. They just get this kind of like, that's a thing we don't talk about, and I just know that it's wrong. But the weird thing is, a lot of times I'll have children where I'll talk to them and they'll be like, yeah, that's wrong because that's a no-no area. And then I'll go, well, why is it wrong? And they'll be like, I don't know why it's wrong. I've just always been told that's wrong and bad. So you need to be able to have that conversation. You need to be able to talk to someone and say, even though it's a very awkward and it's not a fun conversation, you do need to be able to talk to your children, or at least have your doctor or professional talk to your children, to be able to educate them on why it's not good, so that they can actually understand it, so that they don't just are growing up with this, yeah, that's just not something we talk about. I have no idea why it's bad. I just know it's bad. We need to actually talk about it so we can get to the root causes of problems. Children need to understand the root causes. I'm not necessarily saying that you just go down and go, hey, we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty details of the birds and the bees. No, well, it's not really birds and the bees, but the nitty-gritty details of child sexuality. But you need to be able to bring it to them in a manner that they can understand, a manner that's appropriate for their age, and in a manner that they will actually understand the morality and ethics of it. A lot of times I brought it up in terms of them understanding. I'll bring up the, why aren't children allowed to drive? Why aren't children allowed to drink alcohol? I mean, that's the same reason that we have those rules in place. It's because that child is not old enough to understand the consequences. That child is not going to realize what negative effect it has on them when they get older. And when you kind of explain it to them that way, they don't necessarily have to get into the nitty-gritty details of sexuality. They just understand, oh, the reason that this is bad is because I don't know why it's bad, and that's the reason. And that way they can kind of get some better understanding of why this thing is bad. A lot of times when you approach it by just not talking about it and not saying anything about it, a lot of times that can end up doing even more harm, because now those children internalize it. They don't understand sexuality. A lot of times they will blame themselves for the sexuality. And a lot of times they'll either form unhealthy coping mechanisms. And I have seen people do some very different ways of trying to cope with not knowing how to deal with childhood sexuality. The two big splitting factors, they're the type of people who kind of embrace it as a hidden sexuality, where they will develop a coping mechanism of infantilizing or having weird sexual fetishes that have to do with young children, where they haven't necessarily thrown out the idea of childhood sexuality, but because it's never been, brought up with them, they still kind of have that association built up. Or you'll see a lot of times the exact opposite, where the person now identifies sexuality in general with something negative. And so anything that is seen sexual is bad. And so therefore, those are the people who become completely asexual, or the people who find no pleasure in sex, or they'll have a very visceral response to sexuality, where you'll bring up anything slightly sexual and they'll just go, it's stomach turning, because their reaction of coping with not knowing how it is gone to the extreme, where they just go, anything sexual is bad. Therefore, if we have a conversation, I'm just going to not enjoy it and not be able to handle it. And I would argue both sides are bad. We have clear negatives on both sides. You want to try to be able to get it where someone can actually talk about it and explore it in a healthy way, and be able to get better ways of coping with it and better ways of being able to handle it in the future, so that they themselves don't develop poor sexual habits, or poor coping mechanisms, or poor ways of handling sexuality in general. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think I'm going to leave it kind of here. I know that there's not a lot of hard and strict things, but I would say in summation, you want to look at what is the good and bad of it. And I would say the majority of the bad is that inability to have informed consent, the inability for that child to really know the long-term negatives, or the greater reasoning behind the actions that they're doing. I think that people should have an open and honest conversation. I really wish more people had these uncomfortable conversations to really get it out into the open, because I don't think we're helping anybody by keeping this kind of thing hidden and wrapped as the little secret in the family. Hopefully this starts a conversation. Hopefully people will be able to actually discuss these things and feel better about talking about them. I think there's a lot of people who just are not willing to, or because of the negative connotations, will not even have a conversation about it. But I think that it is an important and difficult conversation to have. But I think ignoring it only makes the problem worse with everybody. That is it for this week, I think. I could probably go on into a lot of different intricacies of it, but I think those are the big general points. Tune in next week. We'll talk more about, we'll go over the voting. We'll have a different topic. If you like this specific topic, or there's any topics that you guys want to talk about, please let us know in the comments. And yeah, everybody get your votes in for all members by this Friday, and then we'll see what that money goes towards. Good luck with the Euro Cup. Rooting for Italy versus England. Hopefully Italy wins, but we'll see what happens from that. And everybody, like always, I hope you have a great Sunday. This is Dr. Frank saying bye-bye for now.